Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 4, Captured. Captured. Serpendus Endium woke groggily from a heavy, uneasy slumber. He felt cramped, and the strange floor he was lying on shifted side by side. It was hard, cold, and yet somewhat malleable. He felt his weight press into the smooth floor, pushing it slightly downward like stretched leather. He heard shuffling movements all around him, but he was too afraid to open his eyes. After a time of pondering his predicament and letting his pounding headache subside slightly, he opened his eyes, but couldn't be certain whether they were open or not. Such was the darkness around him. Moving his hands and feet slowly, he realized he was lying in a fetal position inside a round cage. The bars felt like the same stuff as the floor of the cage. In fact, there was no crease or seam where the bars connected to the floor, as if the cage was a single, non-manufactured object. A thick rope of smooth, waxy tendrils encircled his neck, with the other end tied around one of the bars. He slowly pushed against one of the bars with his bare foot and found it slightly pliable like the cage's floor. He wondered where his sandals were, and then nervously felt around inside his robe, where he discovered that the treasures he gathered from the Banwar altar and the Emerald Cave were still accounted for within the robe's hidden pockets. He peered into the darkness, but it was as if a hood covered his face, leaving him musing about how far beneath the earth he must be with such tangible absence of light. The sounds of soft footfalls and movements around him indicated he was closely surrounded by a group of captors, capably and swiftly navigating through the subterranean darkness. "So, this is where I die," he muttered under his breath. "Not by the hands of the Banwar, and not in the mud somewhere on the plains of Undying, and not home in his bed surrounded by his family after living his long life, but here so far underground that no one even knows of its existence, and by the hands of who knows what." Never had he felt such isolation, such emptiness and abandonment. He covered his face with his hands and began to weep. But then he thought of the treasures he carried, and he spat in his hands. Reaching in front of his face, he gripped two of the bars and pulled with all of his meager strength. After several moments of exertion and feeling the cage wobble and sway from his movements, he realized that in fact the fibrous cage was actually grown into its current shape, and its composition felt like the smooth skin of a mushroom. He frantically pulled at the bars again, hoping that the organic nature of the cage would eventually bend. After working up a sweat, he realized with great resignation that this cage rivaled anything made of Canonian metal. Despite his discovery that moisture seemed to relax the fibers of the bars slightly, it was not enough to allow him to squeeze through. He sat up and leaned against the moistened bars behind him, folded his arms, and closed his eyes to ponder other potential solutions to his current plight. Suddenly, interrupting his thoughts, a thin, brief whistling sounded from the darkness, followed by a thick puncture. His cage lurched hard to the side and down in the direction he was leaning on. Was that an arrow? He thought incredulously. But then another whistle reverberated through the tunnel, and another heavy puncture was followed by a splash that shattered the muted darkness. Hisses, squeals, and clicks erupted all around him, and his cage fell completely over. Before he could process even a single thought, he plunged into icy water that nearly stopped his heart from beating. The buoyancy of the cage allowed it to briefly remain afloat, allowing him to take a deep breath before slowly sinking beneath the surface. In this moment, he considered this to become his recurring nightmare for the rest of his life, should he survive. Surrounded in total darkness inside a mushroom-grown cage, his neck tied to one of its bars, and now sinking into the unknown depths of an underground water source deep beneath the surface of the world, he reacted without thinking, thrusting his arms through the bars and hoping that the sudden immersion of water into the fibers of the cage would make the bars pliable enough for him to squeeze through. After pushing and wriggling himself between the cage's bars, he finally escaped. But he had no idea which way the water's surface was, and after a moment of utter panic, he felt a gentle tug on the rope around his neck. "Ah, the cage falls slowly downward, thus I should swim against it," his mind roared. Frantically, he swam against the weight of the tugging rope, finding that the cage still retained its buoyancy, as it hardly had any weight. After several moments of swimming for his life without reaching the surface, and his lungs beginning to burn in his chest, he opened his eyes to find shimmering rays of daylight filtering through the water's surface still far above him. How did I sink this deep so quickly? He wondered desperately. Then he noticed the weight on the rope around his neck was suddenly gone. He threw all of himself into swimming the remaining distance toward the surface. With his lungs nearly bursting with fatigue and his head pounding in his ears, he finally broke the water's surface and loudly inhaled fresh open air, coughing and fighting to remain conscious while treading water. When his eyesight cleared, Serpendus Endium looked around with amazement and confusion through squinted eyes at his surroundings, wondering if he died in those tunnels and his soul had finally arrived at the home of his gods. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.